Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of YouTube videos to help you improve your chess. In today's video, we're going to look at an amateur game. I always say it's a good idea to study mostly master games because you want to see what to do. But to say I don't want to study any amateur games seems a little silly also, because if you study no amateur games, then you're not seeing what other people are doing wrong, how you can avoid doing that, and what you should do to take advantage of that. So I think it's a good idea to study some amateur games, and because there's so few amateur game books, I wrote my book, The World's Most Instructive Amateur Game Book, which I still think is one of my very best books. If you've never seen it, I can pretty much guarantee you can learn something from it. Okay, let's get on with today's amateur game. I think this was played as a slow game on the Internet Chess Club. White played e4, black played e6, white played d4, black played d5, French defense. So now the main variation is knight c3. Second most common would be something like knight d2, Tarrasch. e5 is the advanced variation, e takes d5 is the exchange variation. White plays a rare gambit, and I have the computer running Stockfish 10, and Stockfish 10 hates this gambit. It says, thanks for the pawn. It drops white's evaluation by over a pawn from, being ahead by half a pawn for having white against the French defense to being down almost a whole pawn here. So obviously the computer does not recommend this gambit, but white obviously had studied this and wants to play it, so black of course should take the pawn. And now white attacks the pawn with knight to d2. And black has a big choice here. He can try to hold the pawn with pawns. If he plays something like f5, white might consider playing f3. The only way to break up the pawns is with pawns, and now if he takes the pawn and the knight takes, he's got 3 pieces out to 0, and black's got a backward e-pawn on the semi-open e-file. So white would have some compensation here for the pawn if black tries to do that. Instead, black decides that he's just going to guard the pawn with the knight and eventually give the pawn back, which is what you do a lot of times in gambits. You hold on to the pawn for a while, make your opponent get a little awkward trying to get it back, and give it back at the appropriate time. So white plays c3, and his clear plan is to play queen c2 and get his pawn back. So probably what black should do to delay that is to play either b6, queen c2, bishop b7, again saying to white, what do you want to do, white? Do you want to gambit the pawn completely with f3? Because you're not going to get it back just by attacking it. Or he could even sidestep the b6 idea, play bishop d7 right away, and if queen c2, play bishop c6 with a similar position. In the previous position, it took 2 moves to get the bishop there, and the pawn was on b6. Here it took 2 moves, the bishop's on c6. Here the bishop is blocking the break move with c5, but he is holding on to the pawn. And either way, Stockfish thinks that black is a lot better here. In the game, black delayed guarding that pawn by 1 move, but if he delays it by 1 move, all he's going to get out of it is basically a tempo. He's not going to be able to save the pawn. So he plays knight bd7. White plays queen c2. And now black plays b6. But of course, now white can just win the pawn back with approximate equality, which he should. Knight takes e4. Black attacks the knight. White develops, guarding the knight. And here the computer says black should play knight to d5, hitting the bishop on e3. Instead, black plays h6. I guess that can be a handy-dandy move in some lines, but a lot of times it just loses a tempo. If the bishop goes to g5, it'd have to move twice. Black could easily get out of the pin, and the knight's guarding the knight. Knight to g5 isn't going to do very much. So I'm not sure that h6 does a lot. It's not a complete waste of time, but it's not really necessary. Okay, white plays f3. This unpins the knight from the g2 pawn and overprotects the knight on e4, but it does take away the knight's best square on f3 there, if I can draw lines correctly. So here, Stockfish said the 2 best moves for white were either rook to d1, putting a little pressure on this line with the queen, or of course just playing knight f3, the natural move. For some reason in this game, white decided he was going to give odds of not moving his king knight. So he plays f3. Black now does play knight d5, hitting the bishop, and of course white should not guard the bishop and just give up the bishop pair that easily. He should move the bishop. The question is where. Computer thinks maybe f2 is a little bit better than d2. White chooses to go to d2. All right, so now black comes up with an interesting idea. Black's break moves here are e5 and c5. A break move is a pawn move that attacks a fixed pawn, and right now the d pawn is fixed. It can't go up past those pawns. Black decides he can get in a good break on c5, even if it possibly costs him castling possibilities. So that's what he does. He plays c5, which is a pretty good move. And now probably white should ignore the fact that he could stop black from castling and just take away that knight's best square. Play c4 here. The game could go something like c4, knight b4, giving up the bishop pair but doubling his pawns. Usually if you're going to give up something like the bishop pair, you want to get something. Here white gets a central majority of pawns, and this pawn on the outside isn't that strong. On the other hand, black has the bishop pair and no really big weaknesses here. Stockfish likes black a little bit better. White decides to go for a line where he stops black from castling. But this helps black develop his pieces, and it also moves the white bishop again. And actually, this is actually helping black, even though black can't castle. So here, black has a choice between king e7 and king f8. King e7 is a little more centralized and thus in a little bit more danger, but king f8 blocks in the rook. So what black should probably do here is aim to get his king on f8, but through e7. He should play something like king e7, castle, queen c7, and then if like knight to e2, rook f d8, and if rook h e1, then he can play the king back to f8. And that would get the rook in the game. That's a more logical way of playing, because white's not really going to be able to threaten the black king on e7 right away. Instead, black says, well, I'm going to go to the safer square f8, but now he has the problem of how does he develop that rook on h8. He's not going to be able to move the king up to h7, and playing g6 is a little dangerous because the white dark squared bishop is attacking the king side, and the black dark squared bishop isn't easily defending the king side. All right, so white castles, and now he's got the rook on the same open file with the queen. That's usually a big sign to the player with the queen to move it out of the way. Black obliges and plays the reasonable move queen c7. And here the computer thinks that if white plays c4, maybe white has a microscopic advantage here. Any other move for white is at best equal. White decides to play king to b1. It's very often helpful when you castle queenside to play king b1. It gets it out of the line of attack. It guards the pawn on a2. Still, white wants to get that knight into the game. You know, at some point he's really got to play knight e2 here. All right, so it's black's turn. And now probably black should think about attacking the bishop and starting to push these pawns up against the white king. And also the second idea he would have would be to play king e7 and get the king rook into the game. So those are his two big ideas here. He decides to play a6 first, perfectly reasonable. White brings the bishop back to d3. And here black could continue with his queenside play with rook c8 or b5. And he plays rook c8. Maybe he can get some tactics on the c file, possibly with pushing the pawn up to b4. That's not strictly a break move because white can go past it with c4, but that would entail some risk because white's loosening up his castled position one way or the other. Okay, so white plays the strange move rook to e1. Let's look at the top moves for the computer. Not surprisingly, the computer thinks developing the knight with e2 is among the best moves. The other move the computer is looking at is bishop to e4. if white's not going to move this knight for very long, black's going to build up a pretty good position, because not only is that knight out of the game, but it's keeping the rook on h1 out of the game as well. All right, so white plays the strange move rook e1. Maybe he's trying to discourage black from playing king to e7 by putting the rook on that file, but really the king can just go to e7 now. King e7 isn't black's best move, but it's not ridiculous. The engine wants black to play b5, but it says king e7 is the second best move. All right, so one of those two moves would make the most sense. The idea of king e7 is not to keep the king on the e file where the rook can harass it later, but just to do it for a move or two to get the rook on h8 into the game. Black plays the really ugly and actually quite bad move, bishop takes g1. What he wants to do is do a clearance move to open up the c file. And he's trying to clear out the c file so he can play b5 and b4, or maybe some tricks with knight to b4. But it's not worth it. He's giving up the bishop pair, and not only is he giving up the bishop pair means one side has two bishops and the other side doesn't. White will have the bishop pair after recapturing the bishop on g1, but he's also taking off a knight that wasn't doing anything and allowing the rooks to get in the game. So, not surprisingly, Stockfish drops the evaluation of the position. Right now he thinks black's better by about an entire pawn if he would play b5 or king e7. And after bishop takes g1, the computer actually thinks that now white, with his bishop pair and his bad knight gone, is better by maybe almost a half a pawn. White can take back with either rook here. I would probably just take back with this rook, even though queen takes h2 is a concern. If rook h takes g1, queen takes h2, Stockfish thinks white has a lot of good things he can do, like queen to b3 or c4, and white is not really too worried about losing that unimportant pawn. But I can understand why, people don't want to lose that pawn. I don't in a lot of cases either. So white decides to take with the e-rook so that he doesn't have to worry about the pawn. Black plays b5. That's one of his ideas, was to be able to push this pawn with now the bishop out of the way. White gets the rook back in the game, but he goes back in the game by going to the f file. I guess his idea is to maybe push up the pawns and attack the king on the f file. That's the only reason I could think he would play rook to f1. Black says, okay, if you're going to put your rook on the f file, I wanted to move my king off the f file anyway. So he plays king e7. And the idea, as we said before many times, is to just get that rook in the game. White plays g3. I guess he wants to develop the other rook and he's worried about losing the h2 pawn. So he plays g3. That actually does weaken the diagonal, though, for the bishop. And if we look at the evaluation of the position, before white's move, the computer said white should get the rook on f1 somewhere centralized with approximate equality. And after this kind of nothing move g3, which weakens the diagonal and wastes time, the engine now thinks that black, by playing rook hd8, is actually almost winning the game. And that's what black does. He plays the natural rook hd8. And now he has a little bit of a tactical threat, which white has to see and he has to stop. So the best moves for white here are like rook to d1 and queen to b3. And you'll see why, because when he doesn't play those moves, black will play his little mini combination. So white plays rook h to g1. And now Stockfish says black plays the absolute right move. He plays a little bit of a combination. So what are the tactics involved with this combination? Well, it's basically fork, skewer, and removal of the guard. And if you're one of those people who looks at the first move of this combination and says, I can't play that, I'm losing a piece, then you're making a quiescence error. But you always want to look at these lines to see if you can make something out of them. And the move that black played, which is the best move by far, is knight b4. And it's not so much that the pawn is pinned and he can't take, because the queen on c2 is guarded adequately with the bishop. The problem is that the queen on c2 is guarding the bishop on d2, and when he takes back with the bishop on d3, it's going to open up the line for the rook on d8 to capture on d2. And it's all forced. There's nothing that white can do. He can't move his queen here because the knight and the rook are both attacking the bishop on d3. He'll lose a piece. So he has no choice but to take the knight. And then black's going to remove the guard. White has to take with the bishop. It's the only way he can capture the queen. King takes is illegal. And now that opens the line for rook takes d2. Not a very hard combination. And what's the point of the combination? Well, it does several things. Even though it only trades pieces, it ends up with a double attack. The rook on d2 is attacking the bishop on c2, as is the rook on c8. And he's also attacking the pawn on h2, so he's going to win a pawn. He doubles the pawns in the b file. He gets rid of white's bishop pair, and he gets a rook on the 7th rank. All those things add up to about an extra 2-pawn advantage over what he had before white played rook on h to g1. So now black has a winning endgame. The question is, what's the best way to win? So white, of course, has to save the bishop. Stockfish says the best moves are bishop d1 or bishop b3. As usual, a lot of times when something's attacked, the best way to save it is to move it. I know a lot of people here, a lot of my students would play rook c1 automatically with the idea that my bishop's attacked twice, it's only guarded once, I need to guard it again. Well, it's true it's attacked twice and it's only guarded once, but that doesn't mean you should guard it again. That probably means you should move it. Moving a piece to save it is very often much better than just guarding it. All right, so white plays bishop to b3, and black says, thank you for the pawn. So now black is ahead of healthy pawn. He's got a rook on the 7th rank. His rooks are better than white's rooks. White has a double beat pawn, which is a crippled majority. Black has a healthy 4-on-2 majority on the king side. It all adds up to a big, big advantage for black. When I say big advantage, I mean easily winning with best play. All right, so white plays f4, taking the pawn off the white square so the rook doesn't have to sit there watching it. Black plays rook d8. His idea on rook d8 is to double his rooks on the 7th rank and go after the b-pawn and the king. White's between a rock and a hard place. If he trades rooks, he's got a dead-lost endgame with weak pawns that can be attacked on the king side if he plays rook d1. But if he doesn't play rook d1, black's going to attack the heck out of him. So white decides he's better off keeping some pieces on the board and hoping black misplays the attack. So he plays rook c1. And now he's threatening rook to c7 check. It's true black can play rook d7 and not lose the bishop, but that would keep the rook off the 7th rank. So black starts with a check just to gain a tempo so his rook can go to the 7th rank. White gets out of the check, and black puts the rook on the 7th rank. Okay, so white has to decide what he wants to do. Does he want to counterattack? Does he want to play some passive defense? He goes for the counterattack, rook c7 check. Black plays king f6. At this point, the engine thinks that white's ahead by about black's ahead by about 4.5 pawns. Notice white can never play rook to b1 to guard the pawn because the bishop is on that square. So white just plays g4, hoping to get some play with his bishop, his pawns, and his rooks against the king. And here, the engine said by far the best idea for black here is to just stop that kind of play and play rook g2 and say to white, all right, white, if you want to keep the rooks on the board, you're going to have to give me that g-pawn, and then my king's going to be super safe and I'll have a passed h-pawn. But if you trade off rooks here, your g-pawn's still going to be in big trouble, and you have no attack. So if black would play this move, he'd have about a 5-pawn advantage, and the game would be over. Okay, so black makes things a little interesting by missing the best move. He plays rook takes b2, a very understandable move, but actually, even though that pawn's around the white king, it was more important to win the pawn on g4 and just get rid of all the white's play. And now white should probably play g5 check, trying to open up lines for his rook and his bishop. Instead, he goes for his own doubling on the 7th rank, but that's not going to work very well because black can just move his rook away and threaten, attacks on the back rank, and white's not going to be able to defend those without bringing the rooks back. So really, playing the rook to d1 doesn't quite work. And here, the engine thinks that black's best move is rook bf2. What does that do? It does two things. It takes the rook off the b2 square so the other rook can come down and mate him if white weakens the back rank too much. And it also attacks these weak pawns so that it would make the black king safer and would also make his pawn majority even more powerful. So that would be the number one move, rook on b to f2. Black plays bishop d5, just trying to block the lines and get rid of the defender on the a2 square, but the engine really kind of hates this idea and says it makes the win a lot harder. It's still a win, but before it had black ahead by about 5 pawns, and now he's only ahead by 2. That's a pretty big difference. Okay, so white says, I have nothing better. I'll take over there. And now white should win the pawn on a6 to guard the a2 pawn, which is what he does. Rook c6 check. King e7. Rook takes a6. It might have been slightly more accurate to check first with the rook before he takes on a6. So rook takes a6. So black has to go back to the drawing board a little bit to win the game now. He decides to play rook takes b4 and hit the pawns on f4 and g4. Engine thought slightly better was rook bf2, but that's a hard thing for a human to figure. Why not take a free pawn? White should now start checking the black king a few times to chase him around. He checks that way. That's not as good. Let's see what would have happened if rook a7 check. Rook a7 check is the best move. Computer says black should play king d6. Rook takes f7, hit it, guarding the pawn. Rook a4 going after this pawn. Now the strange move a3. Rook takes a3 check. King b1. Rook b3 check. King a1. Rook b4. g5. This is all not played. We're looking at best play for both sides to see how black might win if white had put up the most resistance. Rook a4 check. King b1. And he likes to repeat the position once before he plays h5. Rook takes g7. This is dangerous. Both sides have passed pawns now. Rook takes f4. Rook g8. Well, I'm not going to go any further. With perfect play, black should win here, but you can see it's not easy. So let's go back to the game. That's what white should do. Instead, white plays rook e1 check, and black simply blocks with the rook and says, you're between a rock and a hard place. If you trade rooks, the rook and pawn endgame is going to be fairly easy. And if you don't trade rooks, I'm going to tie your rooks down to the back rank. For instance, rook f1. Black can play rook a4, doing the same thing, putting him between a rock and a hard place. And white has no really good way to continue. So in this position, white said, all right, I'll give you that passed pawn. And now black has a tactical threat. It's a 4-move tactical threat, but it's a very common one. And it takes place when there's a king trapped on the first rank and there's a passed pawn. And the way the white can stop the tactic is to get his king inside the promotion square here. Here's the square that we could create. And if he gets the king close enough, king b1, e3, king c1. If e2, then king d2. So here, the computer says black should play check, king c2, and then here with a win. So therefore, the right move after king b1, e3, is for white to play rook a3. And if e2, rook e3 check. And black's completely winning again, but at least the game's not over. I mean, it's basically over. So let's go back to the game. Let's see what happens when black has this threat and white just stops to win the b pawn. Because you'll see this tactic in your games over and over again. It's a very common tactic. Rook to b6, black to play and win. Okay, it's very easy. You push the e3 pawn. He takes the pawn. You push the pawn to e2. If he wants to give a check first, and you play king d6, okay. If he wants to play rook b1, it's the same kind of thing. either way, black, if he plays rook to e5, then after the king goes to d6, black's simply going to check and then queen the pawn. That's why white decided instead to play rook b1. And now it's black to play and win. He doesn't have that check and win the pawn anymore. So what should you do in these kind of positions? Well, you simply want to pin the rook to the king and threaten to get a queen. So you play rook f2. And now the threat is rook f1, followed by either rook takes b1, king takes b1, pawn queens, or just pawn queens right away, which is not quite as good, but you're still winning trivially. So there's no defense to that. You know, for instance, if white plays rook checks, black will just zigzag the king toward the rook, check, here, here, and there's nothing left to play for. Rook b1, rook f1. As I said, if he plays king b2, just rook takes, king takes, e1 queen. So in this position, when black plays rook f2, the writing's on the wall, and white resigns. Okay, very nice game for black. You know, his one really bad move in the game was bishop takes g1. That was where he really lost his advantage. And it even looked like a bad move. Other than that, black played nice and solid, and white made a bunch of little mistakes. You know, the biggest mistake that white made all game was missing the fact that black could play knight to b4, but he already had a tough position at that point. Knight to b4 kind of put it from the category where, you know, black might be winning with best play to black is winning with best play. And that's the way it goes. All right. So, you know, we tend to show amateur games. If you do want to send me an amateur game, go to my website, danheisman.com, and email me the game, but don't send it as an attachment. I don't save these games as PGN and load them and stuff. I just usually enter the games manually, so you can just copy and paste the moves into your email text, and that's fine, you know, if you want to do that. If you send it as a PGN file, you know, I'll open it up and I'll change it anyway. So you could do that if it's already a PGN file and you don't want to copy and paste it out. But if you have it as text already, that's fine. Okay, for my YouTube series, this is Dan Heisman. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, you know, let people know and subscribe to the channel and all that kind of fun stuff. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time. Bye.